I would like to, first of all, thank Director Thompson for making the time to come today. We met back in October when we were on Zoom and with our National Housing Provider Coalition with our representatives from across the country. You were there, and I asked you if you would come back and talk to us. You're in the process of making a ruling. I asked you if you would come back and talk to us, if you would come to Kansas City, and then if you would talk to us and hear from us, those of us who are on the front line of housing industry. And you said, I'll think about it. And so I was pleasantly surprised when Natalie, we all talked about Natalie, how sweet she is, when she called and said, yes, that you're coming. So we thank you for being here and being willing to listen to our voices. We appreciate that greatly. And Congressman Cleaver, it was a bonus. There's a bonus to have you here as well. And we thank you, and we thank the staff that's here from FHFA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac, from the enterprises. We thank you for being here and willing to listen to us. I normally talk fast, and I'm going to talk even faster. Because we were hoping for more time, but we always invite you to come back to talk to us. But we're going to condense everything today. If you thought I talked fast before, hold on and buckle up, because I will be talking quickly today. If you want a copy of this, the schedule, you may take a picture of this with your phone. These are our speakers for the day. And when you leave, for the staff, we'll have a packet presentation for you to take with you. But these are our speakers for today. And we thank you all for taking the time to be here. And from our housing industry, we rarely get a chance to speak. And so today is our day to do that. Again, I'm Stacey Johnson-Cosby. I'm part of the KC Regional Housing Alliance, and I'm part of the National Housing Provider Coalition. This is our KC Regional Housing Alliance. We are an alliance of housing providers, those of us who provide rental housing in our region. Collectively with these organizations, which are the Realtors, it's the Landlord organizations, the property management, the investor organizations, those of us who create housing, this is our alliance. Collectively, we represent over 100,000 rental units in our region. So when I say, and when we say today that we are the voice of housing, we are the voice of housing. We always make ourselves available to talk to anyone, from the small investor that may have one or two properties to those who may have thousands in multifamily. The National Housing Provider Coalition, again, is a national group, and we are the small independent housing providers across the country. And you'll hear today that there are 20 million of us providing housing in our community, the largest providers of housing. That's us. And this chart, Dr. Thompson, we showed you this when we were on Zoom. This chart represents who we are. When I say we, this is who we are. The gray represents, this is one of the quarters last year of sales, and I think second quarter 2023. Who is buying the properties? We are. And in the gray are the tier 1 investors that own 9 properties or fewer. We represented 125,000 plus sales this quarter. Everyone's worried about the institutional or the corporate landlords or investors. You'll see them in the royal blue. They represented under 2,000 sales. So we are the providers of housing. Small investors, large to mega investors, 20 million units represented by us. And there it is again, there we are at the top too. And many times, though we are the largest creators of housing, many times we are not in the room when housing policy is being discussed, which is why today is very important to us. We're here today, we've narrowed it down to 3 different tenant protection laws. And these are the ones, Director Thompson, that we know that people are asking you in the ruling that you're going to be making about conventional financing for multifamily rental housing. We know there's 17 senators that ask you to consider imposing rent control on the financing for the creation of those units. We're going to talk about that. And then some of the investor groups and activist groups ask you to talk about source of income, imposing that on the financing, and then just cause or good cause eviction. We're going to go into detail about all 3 of these, but that's what we're focusing on today, knowing that there are a lot more. We hear about cost burden. Many times when we hear about who's cost burden, we hear it about our customers, tenants. But I'm going to tell you a quick story. There is a housing provider here in town. His name is Ron. He owns 70 properties. His family provides housing for 70 families in our market. His property taxes got increased by $50,000 last year. And we all local know that we had a problem with our Jackson County assessment where the Attorney General is now suing them in court in the next couple of weeks, where the auditor has said that your assessment has been flawed, it is incorrect. And we know that because we've worked with some of the people who are appealing, over 3,000 of them. We held workshops to help them appeal their property taxes because the values are too high. People are losing their properties. We have homeowners who are selling their homes because they can't afford the taxes. In particular, a lot of us, so if you imagine you have a problem with one, imagine when you have multiple properties. So at the end of the year, December 31st, he had to write a check for $50,000 to pay for his property taxes. How many of us can pick up on a couple months' notice and write a check for $50,000? He's cost burdened. Add that the increased cost of utilities that we're facing, maintenance, labor, material, and supplies. Out of the blue, the other day, my husband and I had to replace a central air unit out of the blue. And those costs are higher than they were 3 or 4 years ago. Interest rate increases, insurance increases, if you can even get insurance, and then inflation in the economy. And then when we have tenants that are not able to pay their rent, we're paying for our attorney and their attorney. So our costs providing housing are exorbitant. And then on top of that, we have a lot of restrictive anti-business laws that we're facing, including some tenant protection laws and local building codes. Our city council passed an ordinance with building codes that caused the application for home buyer permits, builder permits to drop. All of that is controllable because it's coming from our city hall or our government. And then our customers are cost burdened. We are cost burdened. Our customers, the renters, are cost burdened. We're all cost burdened. And my concern is that when people talk about this, they make it out that we are the bad guys because we're gouging with rents. We are not. We are simply looking at the cost and we're trying to survive. So that is a concern. And we know that the blueprint for Renters' Bill of Rights from the White House said that they're going to try to crack down on unfair prices that are driving up costs. We want you to do that too, but we are not the problem. So help us with the costs that we have, and we can keep our prices down. Many of you know that as local community housing providers and small businesses, that we keep our costs lower than the institutional corporate investors because we're housing our neighbors. Help us keep our costs down, because when we sell, we're selling to the people who don't care about costs, and we will sell if we need to find a friendlier marketplace. Evictions. Everything that we talk about leading to evictions. Why are people being evicted? Why do we have so many evictions? And part of the problem is the cost, when a tenant cannot pay their rent. And so the myth of evictions, what they don't tell you is that 90% plus of evictions are for non-payment of rent. It's not because we're bad guys or we're gouging them or that we're doing something horrible because we're these wealthy old people that are taking advantage of them. That's the narrative. It is not true. If you don't pay the rent, you will be evicted. How do you prevent an eviction? Any housing providers have any thoughts? You pay the rent. And so if someone needs to, we need to address eviction. If it's rental assistance or whatever we need to do, paying the rent stops the eviction. We have another law, right to counsel law locally, that our city council, when they implemented it 3 years ago, they actually allocated $2.5 million for lawyers in an eviction case. Why? If we know that the rent, if you pay the rent, you won't have to worry about an eviction. But when you're paying lawyers, all they're doing is delaying. It doesn't get the rent paid. Use that money for rental assistance if we want to do something to take care of preventing the evictions. Don't have us paying their lawyer and our own lawyers. I was talking to the incoming president of the National Association of Realtors, the year 2025 President Kevin Brown, and he said something that's amazing. He said government has put the burden of taking care of our customers, our neighbors, on our backs, and that now we must restrict our income and our businesses to take care of those who need help, and that is the function of government. So we ask that you please help us take care of our families, because we use real estate to build generational wealth. That's important to us as family businesses, and it's why my husband was able to retire 6 years ago, because we have our real estate business. So it's retirement income for families, and it helps us to have something to pass to our future generations. Real estate is easy to do that, but only when the environment is helpful. These are some of the laws, I'm not going to talk about it, but these are some of the tenant protection laws that are out there. These are the laws that are not meant to create additional housing. Not one thing here creates more housing at a time we're in the middle of a housing crisis. Instead, what they do is they make our jobs more difficult in creating housing. Bob Woodson said it best: you get more of what you incentivize and less of what you punish. Those laws, tenant protection laws, are meant to be punitive. Please make no mistake about that. If you actually look at them, which of those laws create more housing and cause me to want to create more housing? We don't talk enough about home ownership. We know that at the very lowest rung, only 43% of Black families own their homes. Instead of talking about creating a permanent long-term class of tenants, let's talk about creating homeowners. No one's having that conversation with the tenant groups. And I'll tell you something else. I don't need a tenant protection group and a radical socialist activist group to protect my clients from me. We don't need to protect our clients from us. No one's going to take care of my clients better than I will. And so their laws are punitive. This is who they are. If you want to find out, their briefing book is here. and this group is across the country. They're in our marketplace as well. Their goal is to decommodify housing. Should not be bought or sold. It's socialist. They believe that no one should own housing but government. I don't agree. Again, we talk about creating wealth, and they want to disincentivize the speculators, the developers, and the builders, and they've done that. They've stopped some housing in our city as it is, and they're making it difficult for us to create housing. This is what they look like. When they chain themselves to the courthouse doors, they say no rent, stop paying rent. They want free housing. That doesn't work in this economy. This is what they said to me. We did a job fair. They said, here, I think you'll fit nicely. This is who they are. And we make no mistake about it. They disrupt. There's a reason why we have security here today. We're invitation only. They're not productive. We are productive. We are in the business of creating housing. Here's what they say, and it's true. It's unfortunate, but it's true. There's nothing related to housing policy in this town that happens without our approval. People who've never owned a piece of real estate in their lives dictate housing policy in Kansas City, Missouri, while we sit on the sidelines saying we want to help, and we're not invited to the table. Dr. Thomas Sowell, if you know him, he said, it's hard to imagine a more dangerous way of making decisions by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong. Every day on the line. I don't have a guaranteed paycheck. None of us in our business do. If my tenant doesn't pay rent, my income is gone. So I'm interested in making sure my tenant can pay the rent. Maury, one of our local investors, investor groups, did a survey. This was last year, so the number is higher. The question was, how many of you have sold your properties directly as a result of policies coming out of Kansas City, Missouri City Hall? The answer was 853 units directly as a result of those policies. Work with us and not against us, and we don't have to worry about losing these. And I'll tell you who's buying those properties, out-of-state investors. This is what we were doing during the pandemic. Congressman Cleaver, you worked hard to get millions of dollars and billions of dollars in rental assistance to us. Nobody was talking about how to access it. We did. We created 3 events where we told people. We invited the Kansas Housing Commission, the Missouri Housing Commission. We worked with the United Way, our utility companies, our cities, and we invited everyone here to find out where the money is and how to get the money. You prevent an eviction by paying the rent, and we help people learn how to pay the rent through these events. In any event, some of the other events that we've done, we talked about the taxes, the property taxes, where it was going to tax people out of their homes incorrectly. We hosted an event where we saw over 3,000, we did this at a national level as well, so we can tell other people what we did locally, and here's how to get word out about some of these taxes, some of the rental assistance aid. We helped people, over 3,000 people appeal their taxes so they can keep their properties and stay in their homes. We helped people with the job fair during the pandemic. We did that virtually. We do wealth building workshops so people can own their homes. And then we also come up with ideas, and you're going to hear from Jessa about a pilot program about source of income. We created an affordable housing policy proposal. I asked my peers, what would it take for you to create more housing in this housing crisis? And they answered it. It's in our housing proposal. Here are the 5 things that we proposed to the city. We wanted to work on housing the homeless. We have homes. The way you solve homelessness is to create housing for them. We have that. We had a proposal with 100 vouchers, 100 properties to keep people from being homeless, not a word from the city. We've asked them to adopt our voucher proposal, nothing. We did an innovative housing webinar. We are always doing things to create more housing because that's something that we know. How much did the government pay us to create the housing that we have? $0. 20 million units. It did not cost the government a penny. We paid on our own back. Who houses the homeless? We do. The 3 laws today, as you hear these things today, rent control, source of income, ask how many of them actually create more housing. I heard this said about about crime, and I think it works well in our situation. When we have as much homelessness and lack of affordable housing, we have as much as our elected officials will tolerate. Once everyone gets serious about it, we'll come to the table with the other people working on it, and we will do our part, because if nothing else, we know housing. At this time, I'm going to ask our first guest, our first speaker, to come up, and then you're going to hear from them one at a time. But we thank you for your attention, and while he's coming up, if you picked up an index card from the front, once our guests leave, we're going to have an opportunity to interact with the staff from the FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and we'll ask questions of them and hear their questions as well. So if you have questions, please put them on the index card that you got at the desk when you checked in. Thank you all for your patience. Dr. Yoon.
Thank you, Stacey. When Stacey asked me to come to middle of America, the city that she loves, city that she wants to see the dynamism and grow, she said, it may be a good opportunity. Then she mentioned Director Thompson will be here in person. I am from Washington office. Director Thompson is in Washington, but I never had an opportunity to visit her in person in office because we have our advocacy team also visiting FHFA frequently. But Stacey does not want to see her great city, Kansas City, going in the wrong direction from her aspiration of being a great city. So I was asked to talk about the rent control and how this could impact the housing supply in the city. So first, let's look at the U.S. population. We know that the population grows in the U.S. Every year, about 2 or 3 million additional people, birth rate outpacing the death rate, and then you have the immigration, legal immigration coming into the country. So say, unlike Japan, where it's losing population, because of losing population, they have excess housing supply. Price of rent and price of housing are falling in most of Japan because of falling population. But in the US, we have rising population. So we could have continuing increasing home prices, rent, unless we have more supply. It's very common sense, increase more people, we need more supply. So this is the chart showing the population change each year in the red. So how many additional population? Blue line showing the housing unit that is supplied. So in addition to say very old unit that was built say 100 years ago that needs to be demolished and we need to replace, so you always see the gap between population and housing unit supply simply because the housing unit may house 3 people or 4 people, so it does not have to be directly correlated. But you see the gap sort of widening out in the second half of the graph to say that perhaps we are not supplying enough in relation to the population growth in the U.S. In fact, various estimates, so 1.5 million housing units short, according to the Home Builder Association. Freddie Mac did their own estimate of 3.8 million. We conducted our own study utilizing consultants from University of California at Berkeley, and we come to 5.5 million housing shortage. And then there are other studies. For example, 7.3 million rental housing, affordable rental housing for low-income households, according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. So in other words, it's about supply. If we have more supply, we would not have high housing cost issue. So anytime you like supply, automatically it's going to boost rents, it's going to boost home prices unless we have more supply. So we have to address the housing supply situation. So how do we address housing supply? People can come up with, say, 100 different reasons. Some are minute reasons, other more consequential, but some of the ideas that I put is remove some unnecessary barrier to home construction. Sometimes that could be just excessive regulation. Maybe local elected officials just want to express power to say, you have to go through me, you have to give my permission. So, those are all unnecessary. Other time, it's really for debatable cause. You have to weigh the benefit and cost. Maybe environmental protection. We need to protect the environment, but if it's too excessive and we don't produce supply, then we lack housing. So we have to consider what the right balance is. Consider tax incentive to produce more housing, government funding for rehabilitation. I think it's part of the President Biden's new proposal that he put out there, I think in the past 6 months ago. Repurposing some of the empty commercial units into housing units. Maybe some of the land that is owned by the city, owned by the county, can they provide that at a very low cost so that at least from a building perspective, the land cost does not become a sizable element in the total cost. Tiny homes, manufactured homes should also be considered, and also just providing rental subsidy so that that extra demand automatically leads to entrepreneurs looking at potential incentive to provide more housing supply. So some of the policy. What not to do to address housing shortage? Economists would say, don't do rent control. It's simple supply and demand. If you place rent, there's no incentive to provide more housing supply. 94% of economists, just consider any scientific study. I don't know, issue of vaccine. If 94% of the experts studying the vaccine say you should have this or you should not have this, and people oppose that idea, how do we consider those people who oppose what the experts are saying? 94% of economists are saying the rent control is a bad policy. Is a other study measuring it. And go to the last one. This is S.L. Lindberg. He was a Swedish economist. I think before the Nobel Prize in Economics was formed, he decided to say, well, maybe we should provide an economic prize for the Nobel Prize. But one of the comments that he made was the most effective way to destroy a city, aside from bombing, is through rent control. So bombing is an immediate destruction. You place rent control, wait 10 years, 20 years, your city would be destroyed. So that would be the option. So rent control would be the most ineffective policy to go around. So consider other one. How do we prevent hunger? Do we provide a supplemental nutrition assistance program so people can go to the grocery shop and purchase food? Or do we place price control where we would have empty shelves at the grocery store? What is the better way? So rental subsidy is far preferred way than the rent control in terms of trying to help people have that housing over their roof. This is the payroll job comparison between Kansas City and Cincinnati because those are similarly sized. The little better line is Kansas City. I'm just trying to illustrate because Stacey loves this city. She wants to see more dynamism. But this data is for the metropolitan area. How much of job creation is within the city boundary and how much are in the suburb or outlying counties? If you want to have more job creation, you need to provide some incentive for the business community to say that, well, I can do business in Kansas City, rather than to say, no, I cannot do business in Kansas City and I want to be elsewhere or out in the suburb. So if you have policy that is anti-investment, so housing suppliers cannot come into the market, well, then naturally they will go to the suburb. So one has to weigh the balance of it. So overall, Kansas City has outperformed Cincinnati since the year 2000. And consider also for the renters, we would not want to see renters be renters forever because source of wealth is through home ownership. Homeowners have substantially higher wealth compared to renters. So way for the renters to become homeowners over time is to demonstrate responsibility. Demonstrating responsibility means building up credit scores. Building up credit score means paying rents on time. Maybe you require rent subsidy at times, but if one decides not to pay rent, they would have no chance of ever becoming homeowner, no chance of participating in the wealth creation that is provided through ownership property. So we need to assure that tenants can build their credit score over time by consistently taking on the responsibility of paying the rent, even if it requires some rental subsidy over time. This is all cash transaction, recent trend that we have observing to buy a home. I just bring this out because there's a new lawsuit settlement related to NAR. I hope it does not fundamentally change some of the home buying process. I have listened to Congressman Cleaver when he spoke at an NAR event about his personal story, very touching story of how the importance of home in his family. But because of the lawsuit settlement, it may make it more difficult for first-generation buyers to enter the market without going into our complexity. So realtors are very focused on ensuring that the first-generation home buyers would have access to going into the buyer if they demonstrate responsibility, such as building up their credit scores. And second, currently, we are getting oversupply, perhaps it's temporary, but oversupply of apartment construction. Massive apartment construction in places like Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Austin, because so many people are moving into this area. Nashville landscape has fundamentally changed. Recently, I was with Mayor of Nashville, and he wants to bring high-paying jobs into Nashville so some of the underprivileged people living in the city can obtain those jobs over time. And then he wants to build a light rail system, but he does not want to prevent housing supply to come into the city. He understands the importance of housing supply. But at least because of massive apartment construction, temporarily rents are falling in the cities. So if you want to control rent, or you want to see the rent move better for the tenant, we need to supply. It's simple supply and demand. More supply onto the market, then the rents do not have to rise. So right now we are seeing in many cities across the country, you can say temporary oversupply. And the office delinquency rates are rising, indicating that it's an opportunity for some repurposing of the empty office space into possible housing units. Of course, it will require, and I think this is my last slide, sometimes turning office space into residential units could be difficult, the windows, the bathroom, but one can consider other transformation. But number three, Right now, for some of the wealthy donor to university, maybe they should consider donating money for converting the empty office space into some after-school learning centers. Because after post-COVID, many kindergarten to grade school, they are far behind because Zoom learning apparently does not work. So maybe a catch-up opportunity. So maybe some private philanthropists could provide that. And I just put the last one, I put my name because it's just a little thought that I had. And there are some places across the world where people who used to be poor in a single generation are no longer poor. You look at Singapore, for example, they used to be extremely poor, but in a single generation. How did this happen? It happened through responsibility. They said, well, we're not going to tolerate irresponsibility like not paying rent. So we need to assure that if we want to look at the long-term possibility of every citizen in America jumping out of the poverty, we need to encourage responsibility, and this includes paying rents on time rather than giving little nudges to say, not paying rent, that's okay. I think that's not the policy that we want to encourage. So thank you very much for your time.
And so our next panel is on source of income law. This is something we recently passed in Kansas City, Missouri. Earlier we talked about it, Dr. Niemann talked about it. Incentivize, don't penalize. And along those lines, our first speaker is going to tell us what innovative thing they did. I'm going to tell you, Johnson County, Kansas has it right. They bring stakeholders to the table to talk about solving their housing problem. They did a housing for all task force. They invited me to be a part of it. They had builders, they had developers, they had realtors, neighborhood leaders, they had renters, homeowners. Everyone was at the table to talk about housing. And one of the things I think that came out of that, or is part of that, is what Jessa is going to talk about today. Thank you for being here, Jessa. Hello, can you hear me? We can.
Okay. Well, hi. Thank you very much for having me on today, Stacey. Like you said, my name is Jessa Molina, and I'm a landlord liaison with the Johnson County Housing Services Department. So my job is to build collaborative relationships with property owners, property managers, landlords in the Johnson County area, and get them to participate in our Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is formerly known as Section 8. So this program is a long-term rental subsidy program. It helps out mainly elderly disabled fixed income families as well as low-income working families, and then also some families experiencing homelessness. So when I started in my job, I realized that we did not have enough landlord partnerships. And I wanted to understand why. I wanted to get to know people that have the housing. I wanted their perspective. So one of the first things we did was start having conversations with local landlords, including the Landlord of Johnson County Association. We did listening sessions. We did a couple of different surveys where we gathered data. And what we found was that landlords were concerned with the time that it would take and also potential damage to the unit. Even though people with vouchers are no more likely to damage units, what we did was we took their input and we applied for a grant to start an incentive program. And so what we started was a landlord incentive pilot program in July of 2023, and we used COVID relief dollars, SLFRF, ARPA is what it's called, to start our pilot program. And we offered a sign-on bonus for time and effort working with our program, and we offered access to a damage reimbursement claim. So kind of where we're at with the program, we've seen really good engagement from a lot of the local smaller landlords and property owners. We've had about 40 new landlords try our program out, and we've helped to house about 138 families. So 70 of those are low-income working families, and 58 are fixed-income, elderly, or disabled families. Some of the successes of the program, so there's been no damage claims paid out, there's been no evictions so far, and we've been able to increase our housing opportunities in higher cost rental zip codes, including Prairie Village, because landlords are more willing to work with the program in those zip codes. So overall, the program has been successful, and it would not have been successful without the collaboration of our local landlords and them willing to be at the table with us as we try and adapt our program to fit the local Johnson County rental market, which is very competitive and expensive. So we still need more landlords in Johnson County to participate in our program. We've seen housing authorities use what's called a utilization rate as a measure of success. And so 95% utilization of vouchers is considered high performing. So we were at around 86. We started the program, we're now at 92. So we've gone up a significant amount, but we still want to get to that 95% high performing organization status. And so that is an overview of our program and kind of our journey in our collaboration.
Thank you, Jessa. Jennifer?
Can everyone hear me? Yes, I'm loud. I can hear myself. Well, good morning. I'm Jennifer Langston Justus. I'm a realtor, local housing provider, and a housing advocacy junkie, as they call me. Thank you guys so much for being here. It means so much to have you right here in Kansas City. As Stacey has alluded to, we have been fighting regulations pretty much for the last decade very strongly. Those regulations of the KC Tenants and the KC Tenants Bill of Rights have forced many providers like myself to sell their properties. As a mom and pop, we don't have the ability to have oversight committees, increased cost provisions like that, and just the red tape in general as a mom and pop. You're not able to deal with these on a day-to-day basis. I believe, was the KC Tenants Bill of Rights, was that in 2017, Stacey?
About
2019. So with the first wave of that, I was not able to deal with a lot of those provisions, and that forced the sale of about $4 million of property. That was 40 housing units that were transferred 3 times before the actual sale occurred. So to kind of follow that along, the first investor was out of Saudi Arabia. The second investor was out of California. And the third investor that ended up closing on the property was out of Seattle. So they were not involved in our local market. They didn't know our local provisions. Shortly after that, I think within 2 weeks, I started getting calls from those tenants. Do you have other properties that I can rent? My hot water has been out, my garage door won't open, and no one will respond to me to fix these things. I pride myself on being very efficient and quick to service my tenants, but these out-of-state companies don't have those same care to those tenants that we do. So with that sale, I did lease to some of these folks, some of them in the city of Kansas City, which recently, as Stacey has alluded to, we've had source of income protections coming in. Again, this is going to cause increased red tape, paperwork, etc. And quite frankly, I'm just not set up to deal with all of that as a local provider because I am focused on providing the housing, servicing the tenants, and taking care of them. You see, I don't have a management company to do that. I do that myself and work with these tenants directly and try and educate them, as Stacey said, on home ownership. So with that, we are selling 40 more units again, and we are moving to outside markets of the Kansas City area. The risk of this environment is simply not conducive to continue to provide housing. When you look at the stock market, we've always perceived that as potentially more risky investment, but in this day and age, when we are forced to fight litigation, continue to paper our files, so to speak, it just doesn't make sense for local providers to continue to do this. We don't have the wherewithal to hire new people to do this because we've been focused on keeping the cost low. And when you have these increased regulations, that simply equates to more cost. And I really appreciated Dr. Young's analogy. I don't think it's only rent control, but all of these ordinances and regulations are like bombing our city. You're taking the local providers out of the market and bringing in foreign investment. One of the investors that's recently purchased the properties was from Ukraine. And then the other 2, California and New York. Not a single local housing provider has purchased any of the units that I have put on the market due to this regulation. And I never would have looked at selling my properties had these regulations not been an issue. I want to focus on providing and creating the housing. We don't want to focus on papering files and regulations. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you, Jen. And I'll tell you, my husband and I, directly as a result of the policies in Kansas City, Missouri, have sold 13 of our units. Our average rent in those units were affordable, average $600 a month, and a lot of them were homeless veterans that we were housing using the Section 8 voucher. That directly as a result of these cities' ordinances, we left the marketplace because we were looking for something not so possible that welcomed our business, and we purchased in another town as well. We did a survey. Well, this ordinance passes, what will you do? The very bottom shows that 55% said that they will sell their properties as a result of this possible ordinance. My husband and I are one of them as well.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tommy. I'm a local realtor here. I am neutral. I don't own any properties. I'm not a landlord. I just look at numbers and try and interpret them. And numbers by themselves don't have any emotion. We attach emotion to all the numbers here. So you mentioned several times here, we mentioned a couple of different things about landlords selling the Kansas City, Missouri properties. So if this will move, our MLS data. So our MLS covers 48 counties. The very first chart is our MLS growth and the number of listings year over year. So the teal colors are the overall market, all 48 counties in Kansas City that are the MLS covers. The red is the number of percentage of change in listings in Kansas City, Missouri. So in November 30th of 2023, KCMO introduced the ordinance to say, hey, we're going to have this source of income as a potential ordinance. So we saw an immediate drop in the number of listings. Coincidence, maybe, but I think a lot of the landlords were like, hey, let's see what this does. Let's see what we can do. Let's see what can happen. Then the ordinance got passed on January 30th. It takes a little while to get the house for ready to sell. 30 to 45 days, photos, all that stuff. With landlords, we have to have leases come up. But we immediately, the next 2 months, saw an increase over the market in the percentage of listings in Kansas City, Missouri, over everything else. So is what they're saying true? Most likely, yes. We are seeing more Kansas City, Missouri properties sell compared to last year than the general market. In 48 counties is a lot of properties to say, hey, it's not just a small area. We don't just cover 2 counties, and KCMO is the majority of that. 48 counties where Kansas City, Missouri is different than is a pretty significant change there. So as we look at this, it's really small to see here, but this is the red is the states, and the states and cities that have this, and I'll explain this a little bit more. It's more just to see it, that the top states all have source of income laws. Now I lost the quote, there it is. All have source of income laws, or at least have some sort of municipality that has source of income. I'm glad I'm not in New York because the rent there is like $10,000 a month, right? Anybody want to pay that? But we see this, the first state that has no local municipalities that have source of income is number 17 on the list. The first 16 states all have either a full state where there's only one line that has a state source of income. The first 5 all have that. Florida's the next one where the source of income is local, but almost all those where the source of income is a local ordinance. The local ordinance in green is less than the average rent for 2024, is less than the rent where the municipality has a source of income law. Poor North Dakota down at the bottom is one of the few exceptions where it's a state that has that, but they've had it since 1985. And that's probably more to do with the overall economy of North Dakota and location. And it's really cold there. We think it's cold here, right? It's way colder up there. So then I was like, well, maybe this has to do with location. Maybe those are location-based. So I broke them out. Thank you, ChatGPT, for creating some regions for them. So I broke those out by regions. And we start to see in the Great Lakes region that the average rent, where on the left side has source of income laws, Pennsylvania doesn't have a statewide one, but they have some localities. The average income there is almost $100 more rental where there's a source of income law than where there isn't. Here in the Great Plains, we look at Kansas. The average rental for the source of income is $1,292. The municipalities that don't have it is $1,230. Mid-Atlantic, we see the same thing where West Virginia is the only state that doesn't have it. The other 3 states have it. They have the lowest income. If we're looking for affordable income, source of income doesn't necessarily create lower rentals. Why? People are selling, there's less demand, or there's less supply, there's less incentives, there's less things like that. Doing things like Jessa to create those incentives does a lot more than that. Across the board, as we look at each one of these, we start to see that everywhere where there is source of income, it's almost more expensive to live in those states and those municipalities than it is anywhere where there is a source of income. So I encourage, I'm a trust but verify person. I encourage you and your staffs and Congressman Cleaver and Director Thompson, thank you so much for being with us today and bringing your staffs. I encourage your staffs to take a look at this and say what actually drives income and rental costs, and a source of income actually reducing the number of available units that are available for our tenants, thus driving up the price unnecessarily for something like that. So thank you guys so much for your time today, and I think we're on to our next panel.
We're going to try to make up I wanted to just say really quickly while I'm speaking on the stage, source of income law in Kansas City very specifically will force us to take vouchers, Section 8 housing choice vouchers, even against our will. And so what it does, and the thing that we have a problem with, is that it mandates that we enter into a contract with the federal government against our will. And many people think that those of us who don't take the source of income voucher are prejudiced against the majority holders of those in Kansas City, black women. That is not the case. Our problem is that it tells us to go against better business practices. One of the penalties, in addition to a $1,000 fine for felony violation, is jail time for creating housing and fighting housing. That's a problem. We won't take the voucher because it does not, the organization, the Housing Authority of Kansas City, is not an efficient organization that we would choose to do this with. This is problems that I asked my husband, hey, what's going on? It takes 2 to 3 months to get a person from looking at the unit and say, I want to rent it, to actually renting the unit. So in that time, the property sits vacant, the person is unhoused, and losing income. If I have someone who walks in off the street that has a job and a pay stub, I can get into that house in 1 to 2 days. If we go to the Housing Authority of Kansas City, it takes 2 to 3 months. And you wait, we had a transfer, my husband and I had a person transferring from one unit to the other, 4 months. You can't get a return phone call. You can't get a return email. That's why we don't want to participate in the program. The inspections don't happen. You'll get a time that doesn't work. The inspector will tell you the time they were 2 hours late for an inspection with my husband last week. The bot AI system they start using does not work. It just is a simple, it's a program we don't want the organization because they're not efficient and professional. It's not the problem with the voucher. And another problem is the rent's not guaranteed. Many people think, well, why would we want guaranteed rent? It's not for the organization behind it, it's not efficient. It is not the same as someone writing a check in their bank account. So our problem is because of the voucher program. I'll say this really quickly and turn it over to Dan. We had a tenant, 2 tenants in a duplex, 2 women. They got into a fight. They both had vouchers. As a result of the fight, they're both kicked off the program. So we were stuck with 2 people in our unit. Neither one could pay the rent. So the voucher, forcing us to take a voucher, is not guaranteed rent, and it's not the same as cash. We want to just be clear when people say that. Then that is our reality. It's just not an efficient program. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan. I'll figure out the order. Okay, Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Kelly. Been practicing landlord tenant attorney for the last 26 years, and I own rental property in Kansas City. I'm going to speak to you about no-fault evictions. The definition of no-fault evictions is that after the term of a lease is expired and the landlord chooses not to renew the lease, the tenant holds over possession of the property and the landlord must evict them to regain possession. It is very important to remember that this is not a surprise eviction sprung on unsuspecting tenants. They are made aware that they will not be permitted to stay beyond a given date that they have agreed to, and they choose to stay beyond that date. For some reason, this is called a no-fault eviction. That name makes no sense. The goal of every landlord is to have a stable tenant who pays rent on time and never leaves. If your landlord is not willing to renew your lease, you have likely done something wrong. Well, what are the reasons a landlord might not renew a lease? First, it's important to understand that a landlord always loses money when they evict a tenant. There are no exceptions. Tenants frequently stop paying rent when they find out they're being evicted. The landlord is usually required to hire an attorney. Once the tenant is out, the unit remains vacant while the unit is put back in place, changing locks, carpet replaced, wood floors refinished or polished, painting, fixing or replacing fixtures and appliances, paying all the utilities, advertising, and lost revenue while vacant. Usually, the tenant has acted in some way that is making their continued tenancy non-profitable for the landlord. They upset the other tenants in the building, they have loud or unruly guests, they are messy, they cause code violations with the city, they continually pay late, they break things, or possibly they just have a personality clash with the landlord. These are things that may be grounds for eviction, but because the landlord doesn't wish to put an eviction on the record, or because the eviction process is protracted and expensive, or it is difficult to get other tenants to come to court and testify against fellow tenants, or because tenants facing eviction frequently will vandalize the unit, the landlord may choose to give the tenant the contractually required notice that they will not be renewing the lease. The tenant must then choose not to vacate as the agreement requires before the landlord may file an eviction. The 5 goals of no-fault legislation, according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. That's what I'm going to address now. The first one is protecting renters from eviction for no cause of their own. Well, as I just stated, we know this isn't true. No landlord chooses to lose money by filing an eviction or to get rid of a good tenant and risk getting a bad tenant without a cause. The number 2 reason would be delivering a sense of stability to the tenant. And this is a fallacy. The stability comes from the lease agreement itself, as it binds the housing provider for the term of the lease. If you take away the ability to non-renew from the housing provider, they will choose to evict the tenant for the actual causes, which are the reason for the non-renewal. The 3rd reason they provide is discouraging renters from self-evicting when they get eviction notice. What this really means is the tenant living up to the terms of their contract. Being held to the terms of the contract that they signed and choosing to vacate as agreed at the end of the term is not a self-eviction. Self-eviction is a made-up term to make the situation sound bad. The 4th reason they provide is empowering tenants to report substandard living conditions without fear of reprisals. Well, this is a huge topic on its own, but it mostly reflects the failure of municipal health departments and codes departments to do their jobs. Why would a tenant wish to stay in a unit that is substandard? The main reason is most substandard units are priced well below the market rate because they are substandard. They can't find a suitable place to move to at the same price, and if the unit they are in were to be fixed up to the proper standards, the price of that unit would go up. It is the sad fact of reality in urban centers around the country that the majority of private sector affordable housing comes from aging housing stock, which suffers from a multitude of maintenance issues. If that stock were all to be brought up to the proper standards, it would no longer be offered as affordable housing. What governments frequently do is pretend that the affordable housing stock in their city is all up to code, and their job is to catch the occasional bad actor and make them bring the stock back up to proper standards. The reality is that the market has made the stock affordable precisely because of its condition. Why else would a private housing provider offer units for less than they are worth? Protecting tenants from rental increases, that's the 5th reason that they give. First of all, there's nothing in no-fault eviction legislation that prevents a landlord from raising the rent at the end of a term. And who is to say what is a reasonable rental price? Usually it is the market that determines the price. If the rent is too high, no one will rent the unit, and the housing provider will have to lower the rent. If the unit is under market, the landlord will rightfully try to bring the rent up to market value. If at the end of the rental term, the tenant is a good tenant, they will be offered to renew at the market rate, or quite often at a discount, as housing providers recognize the value of a good tenant. If they choose not to rent at that rate, they must find a different place to live. That is what they agreed to when signing the lease. If the market improves during the lease protects the tenant from any increases until the lease expires. If the market falls, the housing provider cannot prevent the tenant from finding better, cheaper accommodations at the end of the lease term. Why should the government step in and say, the market has improved, but the tenant situation has not, so you, as a private housing provider, must now subsidize their lifestyle? How did the tenant's financial situation become the landlord's responsibility? If as a society we decide that tenants should be helped to cope with their economic situation, that burden should be shared by society and not by the housing provider alone. In closing, this law would make it easier to end a relationship with your spouse than it would be to end a relationship with your tenant. What tenant would ever sign a lease knowing that they would never be able to move out without the permission of their housing provider? And that is exactly what this law requires of a housing provider. Thank you for your participation this morning.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. here for two of our lenders, and we're going to talk about behavior. You'll see this is a lender from St. Louis, Missouri, who says don't try to dictate policies, rather incentivize, like we've all said so far today. And so, Ron and Pedro, we'll turn it over to you as our lenders.
Good morning. Commission just speaking. So, as a local lender here, I work with a lot of investors out there and see a lot of activity going on out there with the investors. So, really, I do a lot of loans with Fannie and Freddie for investors, and in the past, that's been a great source of for investors to come and get money for their rentals. The rates are very good out there and very competitive out there for the market. Really of the total number of properties owned out there, 65% are owned by homeowners, right? Another 25% are owned by individual investors out there. We've seen a lot of people talking about that today. Then there's another 10% that are owned by institutional. So that's a really growing number out there, and that's another subject on how rent is affected that I'm not going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about that 25% of individual investors out there. So of those, 60% have mortgages on those, right? Approximately 50 to 60%. So of that 50 to 60%, really it's Fannie Freddie who supplies probably 60% of that. So a lot of the other institutions out there, banks, and really the growing concern are the non-QM companies out there that are really coming into the market and seeing huge advances out there. I was surprised when I look at the number myself. So Fannie has about 75% of the mortgages in the United States today. So a good amount. And of those, about 10% of their mortgages are held by individual investors out there. So a huge market out there that of investors that Fannie Freddie controls, again, the majority of individual investors out there. What we're seeing out there is a switch from Fannie and Freddie is already losing market share to the non-QM companies. I was surprised when I looked at the numbers myself. Since 17, the numbers have been growing every year for the non-QM companies. They conduct business just like Fannie Freddie, right? They sell bonds. These are hedge funds, institutional investors. They sell bonds just like Fannie Freddie, collect a pool of money to loan back out. As those continue to grow out there, if rules are put in place, as we've already seen, that makes it more prohibitive for investors to be able to make money on properties, as Pedro is going to show us, right? Then really that's a huge source of income. And I know because of a little bit higher interest rate that the investors pay, that Fannie makes a good amount of money on this. This is a good source of income for Fannie Freddie. And as controls are put on, and as we've seen landlords continue
for the capital magnet investment funds, we need managers, and we need experts like yourselves to help us go through this. The advisors are great on the East Coast and the West Coast. We're new in the central part of the region, but we are gaining some traction, and with your help and your ongoing support, the capital magnet fund and all the technical assistance and financial assistance funds, and investors like yourselves, we can possibly start making an impact incrementally.
Thank you both, and Pedro will have time to talk to the staff members before they leave, say in more detail about that. And so we're grateful for you raising the issue. Thank you both so very much. We're going to ask our next panel to come up.
Director Thompson, welcome to Kansas City. Congressman Cleaver, very happy to have you here today. My name is Sam Alford, and I have been affiliated with multifamily housing, development, management, syndication, and an advocate for nearly 40 years in the Kansas City area. In the interest of time, I'll condense this as best I can. I think you've heard about cost burden today, and that's what it's all about. The competitive products that are out there that a capital investor can make a choice to invest in is pretty broad right now. So you have to have a commitment to housing, a real commitment to housing, to want to invest in housing to begin with. It's fraught with risk and a fairly marginal return when you compare it to these other products. As an example, you can invest in some multi-storage units today and collect a pretty hefty monthly per square footage rent at little or no risk compared to a residential property and sleep at night. The ordinances that are problematic that we've all talked about today just add additional barriers and obstacles to the investor's choice. And I'll leave you with a brief comment. One of my mentors many, many years ago said to me, capital goes where it's invited and stays where it's welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, hi, I'm Brendan Fishney. I'm the president of Landlords of Johnson County, and I own 15 of my own rentals in the suburban area of Kansas City. Basically, us small to mid-sized landlords, we take all the ownership costs of a property, the insurance, taxes, mortgage, including risk in our own time, and we wrap it up into a nice, pretty little payment called rent, and we take care of that for the tenants. And if we can't get the funding we need because of these regulations, we'll just go find it somewhere else, and often that costs more, putting more of that burden back onto the tenants themselves. I'll also say this, all of my properties I own are within 20 minutes of where I live. So I care about those properties, I care about the tenants in those properties because I live in that community. And I think you'll find a lot of the smaller landlords are in their communities. And if we're forced to go out, we will sell to the out-of-state investors that don't care about these communities. And so we need more local housing providers, not less.
Local housing provider. We self-manage and own all of our properties in the Kansas City market. Because we have 40 properties here that we, like I said, self-own and manage. With some of the restrictions that are being passed down through the source of income and the rent regulations, it's making it harder for us to do business. I don't have to regurgitate some of the things that people say, but with the cost going up just to do business in Kansas City, no threats are being made that people are going to sell their properties. I mean, it's just becoming a business decision. It's no longer reasonable to keep those properties if you can't increase the rents to accommodate for the costs associated with that. And I think to Stacey's point too, just inviting us to the table, having the opportunity to speak to you all so you can hear from our perspective, I think is valuable. So we thank you again for coming out. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Please, if you all will stay here, we're going to continue the conversation with the staff members with you all. But before you leave, I'd like to give you all, first of all, say thank you for being here. We're not often invited to the table to talk about what we do best. We create housing. So today is special for us. I'm going to give you the mic to see if you have any feedback, comments, questions for us before you leave, and we're going to set you free.
Look, I was mayor here for 8 years and on the council before that and in Congress for 19 years. We've never had, to my knowledge or recollection, one of the directors of FHFA coming into our community. The reason I mention that is because I think that we do have a crisis. And as I said in the committee, that I was fortunate to lead the Housing Committee, which I hope to lead again in January. The point I want to make here is that it is one of the top issues facing this nation. And so I am very, very pleased that Director Thompson is coming to Kansas City and has sat down and met all morning groups like this. And I can also tell you that she is responsive. So I appreciate all of you coming. I know many of you, and I appreciate Fannie and Freddie for also coming. So thank you very much for your time today. I think this was beneficial for the director, certainly it was beneficial to me. Thank you.
I think it's important recognize that housing goes through cycles. We've had these shortages in my lifetime. I've lived it. My career spans over 42 years now in building and providing housing. And housing shortages are nothing new. The underlying causes are similar, but they differ each time in terms of what the general economy is doing. One thing is common to the solutions that we've come to over the years is that incentives always work better than mandates. There are market choices, and as I said earlier, people have choices as to how they want to invest their money. No one's really making a gold mine out of any of the housing projects that I know. Commonly, probably not well known, but commonly the A-plus properties think that a 7 or 8% return on investment right now isn't too bad. So if you drill down a little bit to some of the smaller ownerships, they're settling for less than that. And just because it is a marginal business, and we work on efficiencies and we work on best practices, anytime outside forces interfere with any aspect of our operations, it makes it harder, it makes it more expensive, it makes it much more difficult to achieve the end goal of having an adequate inventory of affordable units.
Well, I hope not to repeat myself too much. I'll just read what I got here. First, I'd like to share a little bit about how rent amounts are determined, because a lot of people think rent rates are just set randomly, and they're actually set by what the market will bear. So a housing provider has to take all the costs of ownership, the tangible parts, which is like the maintenance, taxes, insurance, but they also have to include intangible things like their risk, their time to manage those properties, anything like that. And there's never a guarantee that the rent will be paid. Tenants lose jobs, they have unexpected life changes, or something even more outrageous like a governmental moratorium that lets tenants stay housed rent-free. And we have to, as investors, have to be diligent about charging enough that covers all these possibilities if we want to remain in business. And while homeownership is a great goal, there are people out there who either choose not to own a property or aren't yet in a position to buy. And us local housing providers are the solution for those families. If these regulations are put in place, it will disincentivize people like myself from investing in their communities. And then more big and sensitive out-of-state investors will come and buy up everything instead, and they don't care about the communities because they don't live here. If investors choose to continue in spite of these regulations, they'll search for other ways to finance properties that are more expensive, and then they'll put that burden back on the tenants themselves. On the other hand, if the investors choose to leave the market, then that will cause an already low supply of rental housing to become even lower. And the demand on these few properties will then again cause rents to rise. Small and mid-sized housing providers are typically investing for either like supplemental income or they're supplementing their retirement. They're not huge businesses with lots of time and money to deal with these extra regulations. Housing providers take all the headaches of home ownership and they wrap it all up into a payment of rent. And we deserve to have our private property rights protected for the risk and the work it takes to provide this much needed housing. I just encourage everybody to look at both sides of the equation when you're looking at these regulations and trying to find solutions that actually work and benefit everyone.
Quickly, I guess kind of as a final reminder, as I sit and attend some of these sessions, as a housing provider, I think the thing that we don't emphasize enough is that we're small business owners at the end of the day. We're also families, we're people too. And I think some of the tenant agencies or organizations, they vilify us as these big conglomerates. Well, we're the small guy. We're the guy that lives next door to you. We're the guy that you see at the grocery store or at the hospital or wherever. We're not some far out entity that you never can touch, feel, or see. And as we're trying to grow and develop our businesses, because that's what it is, we're all in business to make money. There are not-for-profit housing providers, but I'm sure the majority of us are for housing. for-profit housing providers. I rent to low and affordable tenants. I mean, we rent to agencies, you know, so we're doing our fair part. But if we don't have a voice as to how we do business, it does make it a little bit more difficult for us to continue in that vein and to want to continue to do the business itself. So thank you all so much for coming and hearing us out today. I don't know if anybody has